There are two types of skilled people in the world. The first type learns what everyone else learns. They follow the same tutorials. They take the same courses. They build the same portfolio projects. They compete in the same crowded markets where 1,000 other people can do exactly what they do. Then there is the second type, the invisible elite. These are people who possess skills so unique, so deeply embedded in experience and context, that no one can replicate them. Not through courses, not through copying, not even through artificial intelligence. They are not famous. They are not loud about what they know, but they are irreplaceable, and they command opportunities, respect, and compensation that others cannot access. Here is what most people do not understand. The skills that make you truly valuable are not the ones listed in job descriptions. They are not the technical abilities you can learn in 6 months from an online course. The skills that make you irreplaceable are invisible. They live in your judgment, your intuition, your ability to synthesize information across unrelated domains, your capacity to navigate complexity that has no clear answer. These skills cannot be automated. They cannot be outsourced. They cannot be copied by watching you work. This is about becoming part of the invisible elite. The people who build skills so rare and contextual that attempting to mimic them is futile. You will learn exactly which skills are impossible to replicate, why they are impossible to replicate, and most importantly, how to deliberately build them so you become someone no one can replace. Let's begin. Skill 1. Pattern recognition across unrelated domains. Most people develop expertise in one narrow domain. They become very good at one thing, and then they wonder why someone with less technical skill gets promoted over them, gets the opportunity, gets the recognition. The answer is pattern recognition across unrelated domains. This is the ability to see connections between fields that appear completely separate, to take a principle from biology and apply it to business strategy, to recognize that a problem in software architecture is structurally identical to a problem in urban planning, to synthesize insights from psychology, economics, history, and engineering into a unified understanding that no single domain expert can access. This skill is unmimicable because it requires breadth of knowledge combined with depth of understanding. You cannot fake it. You cannot learn it from a single book or course. It emerges only from years of deliberate cross-domain exploration, combined with the cognitive ability to find patterns in apparent chaos. Here is why this skill is so valuable. Most complex problems exist at the intersection of multiple domains. The person who can see across those domains has insight that specialists cannot access. A software engineer who only knows code will build a technically sound product that no one wants. A software engineer who understands psychology, behavioral economics, and design thinking will build products that people cannot stop using. A manager who only knows management theory will apply frameworks that do not fit reality. A manager who understands game theory, evolutionary biology, and military strategy will navigate organizational politics and competition with precision that baffles others. The invisible elite do not just know their field. They know 5 fields, and they see how those fields connect in ways that create unique insight. Here is how to build this skill deliberately. First, identify your core domain. This is where you have depth, where you have years of experience, where you genuinely understand the complexities and nuances that outsiders miss. You need this foundation. Without depth somewhere, breadth becomes superficiality. Second, choose 3 to 5 adjacent domains that interest you, not random domains. Domains that seem completely unrelated to your core field, but share underlying principles or structures. If you are in business, study evolutionary biology to understand competition and adaptation. Study military strategy to understand positioning and resource allocation. Study physics to understand systems and leverage points. If you are in creative work, study mathematics to understand structure and constraints. Study cognitive science to understand attention and perception. Study philosophy to understand meaning and narrative. Third, consume content at the intersection of these domains. Read books that explicitly connect different fields. Seek out thinkers who synthesize across disciplines. Pay attention when someone from one field explains a concept using analogies from another. Fourth, practice making connections explicitly. When you encounter a problem in your core domain, ask yourself, what does this structurally resemble in biology, in physics, in history? Force yourself to find the parallel. Write it down. Test whether the principle from the other domain actually applies. Fifth, teach these connections. Explaining cross-domain insights to others forces you to clarify your thinking. It reveals where your analogies are weak. It builds your ability to communicate complexity in ways that specialists cannot. Over time, You develop a mental library of patterns that exist across all domains. You see the same structures repeating in different contexts: competition, cooperation, feedback loops, phase transitions, network effects, power laws. When you can recognize these patterns instantly and apply insights from one domain to solve problems in another, you possess a skill that no specialist can replicate, because they only know their domain, and you know 5. This is unmimicable because it requires years of genuine curiosity across multiple fields combined with the cognitive flexibility to hold contradictory frameworks simultaneously and know when each applies. No course can teach this. No tutorial can replicate this. No AI can synthesize across domains the way a human with deep contextual understanding can. This is the first skill of the invisible elite. Skill 2. Intuitive decision-making under uncertainty. There is a type of expertise that cannot be explained, cannot be written down, cannot be transferred through instruction. This is intuitive decision-making under uncertainty. The ability to make the right call when there is no clear data, no obvious answer, no precedent to follow. Most people freeze when faced with uncertainty. They wait for more information. They analyze endlessly. They seek consensus. And by the time they decide, the opportunity is gone. The invisible elite make decisions quickly under conditions where others cannot even begin. And they are right far more often than chance would predict. Not because they are guessing, but because they have developed intuition through thousands of hours of exposure to similar patterns. Here is what intuition actually is: compressed pattern recognition developed through experience. Your brain has processed so many similar situations that it recognizes the pattern before your conscious mind can articulate why. A chess grandmaster looks at a board and instantly knows the best move. They cannot always explain why. The pattern is stored in their unconscious. Tens of thousands of games have trained their brain to recognize which positions are strong and which are weak. An experienced investor looks at a pitch deck and knows within minutes whether the founder will succeed. Not from the metrics, from something in the way the founder talks about the problem, the level of detail in their understanding, the quality of their questions. The investor has seen this pattern hundreds of times. Their intuition is calibrated. A seasoned doctor examines a patient and orders a specific test that reveals a rare condition. The symptoms were ambiguous. The textbook would suggest something else. But the doctor has seen this exact constellation of subtle signs before. Their intuition recognized it. This skill is unmimicable because it requires not just exposure, but reflective exposure. You cannot develop accurate intuition by passively experiencing things. You must actively process each experience. Notice what worked. Notice what did not work. Update your internal models. Build pattern libraries in your unconscious. Here is how to build intuitive decision-making deliberately. First, you need volume of experience. There is no shortcut here. You cannot develop chess intuition without playing thousands of games. You cannot develop business intuition without making hundreds of decisions and seeing the outcomes. But volume alone is insufficient. Plenty of people have years of experience and terrible judgment because they did not process the experience. They did not learn from it. Second, practice predictive reflection. Before making a decision, write down what you predict will happen and why. After the outcome is known, review your prediction. Where were you right? Where were you wrong? What patterns did you miss? What false patterns did you see that were not there? This feedback loop is what builds calibrated intuition. Most people make decisions and never review them. They remember their hits and forget their misses. Their intuition does not improve because they are not tracking accuracy. Third, study your errors more than your successes. Successes can happen for the wrong reasons. You can make a bad decision and get lucky. Errors reveal where your mental models are broken. When your intuition is wrong, dig into why. What pattern did you think you saw? What was actually happening? What information did you weight too heavily? What did you ignore that mattered? Fourth, expose yourself to adjacent contexts. If you only ever make decisions in one narrow domain, your intuition will be narrow. But if you make decisions across related contexts, your brain learns which patterns transfer and which are context-specific. A manager who has only worked at one company has narrow intuition about organizational dynamics. A manager who has worked at a startup, a mid-sized company, and a large corporation has calibrated intuition about which management principles are universal and which are context-dependent. Fifth, develop metacognitive awareness. Learn to recognize when your intuition is reliable and when it is not. Your gut feeling about technical architecture might be extremely accurate. Your gut feeling about people might be consistently wrong. Know the difference. The invisible elite have intuition that has been built over thousands of decisions with active feedback loops. They know when to trust their gut and when to override it with analysis. They make decisions quickly in domains where they have calibrated intuition and slowly in domains where they do not. This skill is unmimicable because you cannot shortcut experience. You cannot download someone else's intuition. You can learn their frameworks. You can copy their process. But you cannot replicate the unconscious pattern recognition that comes from processing thousands of similar situations with reflective feedback. This is the second skill of the invisible elite. Skill 3. Creative problem solving in novel contexts. Most people are good at solving problems that have been solved before. They follow established processes. They apply known frameworks. They execute recipes. But when they encounter a problem that has never been solved before, they freeze. Because there is no template, no best practice, no expert to consult. The invisible elite thrive in novel contexts. They are the people you call when no one knows what to do, when the situation is unprecedented, when the old rules do not apply. This is creative problem solving, the ability to generate solutions to problems that have no established answer. This skill is unmimicable because it requires a specific combination of attributes that cannot be taught directly. Deep domain knowledge combined with cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold contradictory ideas simultaneously, comfort with ambiguity, willingness to explore dead ends. Here is what separates great problem solvers from mediocre ones. Mediocre problem solvers try to find the right answer. Great problem solvers try to find multiple possible answers and then determine which one fits the constraints. When faced with a novel problem, most people immediately jump to solution generation. They start brainstorming. They throw out ideas. They look for the first thing that might work. This is backwards. The invisible elite start with problem definition. They spend far more time understanding the problem than generating solutions. Because if you misunderstand the problem, even a brilliant solution will fail. They ask, what is the actual problem here? Not the symptom. Not what people say the problem is. What is structurally causing this issue? They ask, what are the constraints? What cannot change? What resources are available? What timeline exists? They ask, what would success look like? What are we actually optimizing for? What trade-offs are we willing to make? Only after deeply understanding the problem do they move to solution generation. And here is where cognitive flexibility becomes critical. The ability to approach the problem from multiple angles, to see it as an engineering problem, as a people problem, as a resource allocation problem, as a communication problem, as a timing problem. Each lens reveals different potential solutions. Then they test their solutions not by implementing them, but by reasoning through consequences. If we do this, what happens? What second-order effects occur? What breaks? What new problems emerge? This is systems thinking applied to creative problem solving. Most people think one step ahead. The invisible elite think 3 steps ahead. They see the cascade of consequences that a naive solution would trigger. Here is how to build creative problem solving skills deliberately. First, practice constraint manipulation. Take a problem you are trying to solve and deliberately change one constraint. What if you had unlimited budget? What if you had zero budget? What if you had to solve it in 1 day? What if you had 10 years? What if you could only use software? What if you could not use any technology? Each constraint change forces you to think differently about the problem. Most people accept constraints as given. Elite problem solvers question which constraints are real and which are assumed. Second, study solutions from unrelated fields. When you encounter a clever solution to a problem in one domain, ask yourself, what class of problem does this solve? Where else does this same class of problem appear? Can I adapt this solution to a completely different context? Third, practice adversarial thinking. For every solution you generate, try to break it. What are all the ways this could fail? What am I not seeing? What assumptions am I making that might be wrong? This prevents you from falling in love with your first idea. It forces you to stress test before implementation. Fourth, develop comfort with dead ends. Most people avoid exploring ideas that might not work. Elite problem solvers deliberately explore dead ends because even failed solutions teach you something about the problem space. Fifth, build a personal library of mental models and frameworks. First principles thinking, inversion, second-order effects, leverage points, feedback loops. The more frameworks you have, the more ways you can approach any problem. The invisible elite are creative problem solvers not because they are naturally more creative, but because they have built systematic approaches to exploring solution spaces. They know how to break down novel problems, how to question constraints, how to think in multiple dimensions simultaneously. This skill is unmimicable because it requires depth of knowledge combined with breadth of perspective, combined with practice solving hundreds of hard problems with no clear answer. You cannot teach this in a course. You cannot copy it by watching someone work. You can only build it through years of deliberately practicing problem solving in increasingly complex contexts. This is the third skill of the invisible elite. Skill 4. Contextual judgment and knowing when rules do not apply. There are people who follow rules, and there are people who know when to break them. Most people learn frameworks and apply them rigidly. They find a process that works and use it everywhere. They discover a principle and treat it as universal truth. The invisible elite understand something more subtle. Every framework has boundaries. Every principle has contexts where it applies and contexts where it fails. Every rule has exceptions. This is contextual judgment. The ability to recognize when established wisdom applies and when it does not. A manager learns that radical transparency builds trust. They apply it everywhere. Then they share information in a context where it creates panic and confusion. Because they did not recognize that the principle of transparency has boundaries. There are situations where information timing matters, where full context is necessary before sharing, where transparency without wisdom is destructive. A designer learns that simplicity is good. They remove features aggressively. They create a product so simple it cannot accomplish what users need, because they did not recognize that simplicity is a means to an end, not the end itself. There are contexts where complexity is necessary. An entrepreneur learns that speed is everything. They move fast and break things. They ship before ready. They create technical debt that cripples the company, because they did not recognize that speed has costs, and there are situations where deliberate slowness creates more value. This skill is unmimicable because it requires not just knowing the rules but understanding why the rules exist, what problem they solve, what assumptions they make, under what conditions those assumptions hold. Most people learn what to do. The invisible elite learn why it works, and therefore they know when it will not work. Here is how contextual judgment develops. First, whenever you learn a principle or framework, do not just learn the principle. Learn the context in which it was developed. What problem was it designed to solve? What assumptions does it make about the environment? What trade-offs does it optimize for? A startup that is burning cash needs to move fast. A profitable company optimizing for long-term compounding can move deliberately. The principle of speed made sense in the first context. It might destroy value in the second. Second, practice recognizing category errors. This is when someone applies a framework from one category to a situation in a different category where it does not fit. Political principles apply to family relationships. Engineering principles apply to creative work. Sports analogies apply to complex organizational dynamics. Most bad advice comes from category errors. Someone succeeded in one context and assumes the same approach will work in a completely different context. But the contexts are not analogous. The variables are different. The constraints are different. Third, study failures that came from following best practices. This is counterintuitive. Best practices are supposed to work, but every best practice has situations where it fails spectacularly. Find examples where someone did everything right according to established wisdom and still failed. What was different about their context? What variables mattered that the best practice did not account for? Fourth, develop the ability to hold contradictory principles simultaneously and know when each applies. Transparency is valuable. Confidentiality is valuable. Both are true. The question is not which is right, but when each applies. Move fast and break things. Go slow and build it right. Both are true. The question is which context you are in. Focus on one thing. Diversify broadly. Both are true. The question is what you are optimizing for and what stage you are at. The invisible elite do not have one philosophy. They have multiple philosophies and the judgment to know when each fits. Fifth, practice metacognitive reflection on your own decision making. When you make a decision, write down which principle or framework you are applying. After you see the outcome, ask, did that principle fit this context? What nuances did I miss? What would I do differently? Contextual judgment is what separates people who can execute a known playbook from people who can navigate genuinely novel situations. Because in novel situations, the playbooks do not quite fit. You need the judgment to know which parts to keep and which parts to discard. This skill is unmimicable because it requires both breadth of knowledge across many frameworks and depth of understanding about why those frameworks work. You cannot fake contextual judgment. It shows immediately when someone applies a principle in a context where it does not belong. The invisible elite have developed enough experience across enough contexts that they recognize patterns of when rules apply and when they break. They know the boundaries of every framework they use, and they adjust dynamically based on the specific situation. This is the fourth skill of the invisible elite. Skill 5. Relationship capital and earned trust networks. There are skills you build, and there are assets you accumulate. Relationship capital is both. This is the network of people who trust you, who will take your call, who will vouch for you, who will give you opportunities before they are public, who will tell you the truth when everyone else is telling you what you want to hear. This asset cannot be built quickly. It cannot be faked. It cannot be transferred. You might be able to buy access. You might be able to manufacture visibility, but you cannot buy genuine trust that has been earned over years of repeated interactions where you demonstrated integrity, competence, and reliability. Here is what most people misunderstand about networking. They think it is about collecting contacts, going to events, adding people on LinkedIn, having a large follower count. That is not relationship capital. That is a contact database. Relationship capital is when someone you worked with 5 years ago gets promoted to a position of influence and immediately thinks of you for an opportunity. Not because you stayed in touch through performative networking, but because you did exceptional work together and they remember how you operate. Relationship capital is when you reach out to someone you have not spoken to in years, and they respond immediately because the relationship was built on genuine value exchange and mutual respect. Relationship capital is when you need advice on a complex problem, and you have access to multiple people who deeply understand that domain and are willing to share honest perspectives with you because they trust your judgment and know you will not waste their time. This skill is unmimicable because it requires time and consistent behavior. You cannot speedrun trust. You cannot hack years of demonstrated reliability. Here is how relationship capital is built. First, focus on depth over breadth. Most people try to know everyone. The invisible elite focus on knowing the right people deeply. They invest in relationships that are mutually valuable and genuine rather than collecting superficial contacts. Quality of relationship is exponentially more valuable than quantity of contacts. One person who genuinely trusts you and understands your capabilities is worth more than 1,000 LinkedIn connections who barely remember meeting you. Second, create value before asking for value. The fastest way to destroy relationship capital is to only reach out when you need something. The way to build it is to consistently offer value, insight, connections, or help without expecting immediate return. When you see an article that someone would find valuable, send it to them. When you meet someone who should know each other, make the introduction. When you have insight into a problem they are facing, share it. This is not transactional. This is building a pattern of being someone who adds value to others' lives. Over time, you become the person they think of when opportunities arise. Third, demonstrate reliability in small things. Relationship capital is built through repeated evidence that you do what you say you will do, that you show up on time, that you follow through, that you do not waste people's time. Most people are unreliable in small ways. They say they will send something and forget. They commit to a meeting and cancel at the last minute. They make introductions without context and create work for others. The invisible elite are obsessively reliable. If they say they will do something, it happens. This builds a reputation that compounds. People know that working with you will not create unexpected problems. Fourth, tell the truth even when it is uncomfortable. Relationship capital is destroyed by dishonesty. Even small dishonesty. Even dishonesty through omission. When everyone is telling someone what they want to hear, the person who tells them the truth creates enormous trust. But only if they do it with respect. Only if they have earned the right through demonstrated competence and care. Fifth, play long-term games with long-term people. Do not optimize for extracting value from relationships. Optimize for building relationships that compound over decades. The opportunities that come from deep trust relationships are often invisible to outsiders. They happen through private conversations, through people thinking of you when they encounter a problem, through referrals and recommendations that never go public. This is unmimicable because you cannot fake years of consistent behavior. You cannot manufacture genuine trust. You cannot replicate the network of people who have worked with you, seen your character under pressure, and decided you are someone they want in their corner. The invisible elite have relationship capital that took decades to build. It gives them access to opportunities, information, and support that others cannot access. Not because they are better at networking, but because they are better at being someone worth knowing. This is the fifth skill of the invisible elite. Skill 6. Taste, discernment, and aesthetic judgment. There is a type of expertise that is impossible to quantify but immediately recognizable. This is taste, the ability to recognize quality, to distinguish between good and great, to know what works before testing it. A designer looks at two layouts. To most people, they look similar. To the designer with developed taste, one is clearly superior. They can explain why. The proportions, the negative space, the visual hierarchy, but the judgment came first. The explanation came after. A writer reads two paragraphs. Both are grammatically correct. Both communicate the same information, but one has rhythm, one has clarity, one has voice. The writer with taste knows immediately which is better. They can articulate why, but the knowing came before the articulation. An investor evaluates two business plans. Both have reasonable projections. Both have defensible strategies, but one has something extra. The investor with taste recognizes it. They might call it elegance, or simplicity, or strategic clarity. It is the difference between a good business and a great one. This skill is unmimicable because taste cannot be taught directly. It can only be developed through exposure to excellence combined with deliberate practice in evaluation. You do not develop taste by reading about taste. You develop it by consuming massive amounts of work in your domain and actively judging quality. Here is how taste develops. Fast, immerse yourself in excellence. If you want to develop taste in writing, read the best writers, not just casually, analytically. Why is this sentence better than an alternative? What makes this paragraph land? Why does this structure work? If you want to develop taste in design, study great design, not just look at it, deconstruct it. What makes this composition work? Why does this color palette feel right? What are the subtle details that elevate this from good to great? Most people expose themselves to mediocrity and excellence equally. They consume whatever is convenient. The invisible elite are deliberate about consuming excellence. They study masters. They learn what great looks like. Second, practice making aesthetic judgments explicitly. When you encounter work in your field, force yourself to evaluate it. Is this good or bad? Why? What specifically makes it work or not work? Write down your evaluation before looking at others' opinions. Over time, your judgment becomes calibrated. You start recognizing patterns of quality. You develop intuition for what works. Third, compare your judgments to recognize masters. When you evaluate something as excellent, check whether experts agree. When you evaluate something as mediocre, see if people with developed taste saw something you missed. This feedback loop is what calibrates taste. You learn where your judgment is accurate and where you are missing nuance. Fourth, create work and subject it to evaluation. The fastest way to develop taste is to create and get feedback from people with better taste than you. They will see things you missed. They will point out weaknesses you could not recognize. You will internalize their standards. Over time, you develop the ability to evaluate your own work with the same rigor. You become your own toughest critic. Fifth, study the edges of taste. What makes something cross from good to great? It is often subtle, a small adjustment that changes everything. The invisible elite have developed sensitivity to these subtle differences. They notice when a product is almost right, but something is slightly off. They recognize when a strategy is directionally correct, but the execution will fail. They see quality differences that others miss. Taste is unmimicable because it requires years of exposure to excellence combined with deliberate practice in evaluation combined with creation under feedback from people with superior judgment. You cannot copy someone's taste by watching them work. You cannot learn it from a course. You can only develop it through sustained immersion in quality combined with active judgment practice. The invisible elite have taste that has been developed over years. It allows them to make judgments about quality that others cannot see, to recognize greatness before it is obvious, to know what will work before evidence exists. This is the sixth skill of the invisible elite. Skill 7. Strategic narrative construction and meaning making. The final skill of the invisible elite is the most subtle and perhaps the most powerful. This is the ability to construct narratives that give meaning to events, to tell stories that change how people understand reality, to frame situations in ways that create clarity from chaos. Every organization, every movement, every successful career sits on top of a narrative. The narrative is not the facts. The facts are neutral. The narrative is the interpretation of the facts, the story that gives them meaning, the frame that determines what matters and what does not. Two people can experience the same events and construct completely different narratives. One sees failure and evidence they should quit. One sees learning and evidence they are making progress. One leader frames a crisis as a threat to be avoided. Another frames the same crisis as an opportunity to be seized. The facts are identical. The narrative changes everything. The invisible elite are master narrative constructors. They understand that reality is not just what happens, but how what happens is interpreted. And they have developed this skill to shape interpretation. This is not manipulation. This is clarity. This is taking complex, ambiguous situations and constructing a coherent story that helps people understand what is happening and what to do about it. Here is why this skill is so valuable. Humans think in stories. We do not process raw data well. We process narrative. We understand cause and effect, heroes and obstacles, arcs and resolutions. The person who can take a complex situation and construct a clear narrative that explains what is happening has enormous influence, because they give people a map, a way to orient, a story that makes sense. Here is how narrative construction works. First, identify the salient facts. In any complex situation, there are hundreds of data points. Most are noise. A few are signal. The narrative constructor identifies which facts actually matter. Second, establish causal relationships. Why did this happen? What led to what? This is where interpretation enters. The same facts can support multiple causal stories. The narrative constructor chooses the causal frame that is both accurate and useful. Third, identify the protagonist. Every story has a protagonist. In a business narrative, it might be the company, it might be the customer, it might be the market. Who you make the protagonist changes the entire story. Fourth, define the conflict. What is the obstacle? What is the challenge? What tension needs to be resolved? The way you frame the conflict determines what actions make sense. Fifth, point toward resolution. What does success look like? What is the path forward? A good narrative does not just explain the past. It creates a vision of the future that guides action. This skill is unmimicable because it requires both analytical ability to identify signal from noise and creative ability to construct coherent narrative, and emotional intelligence to know which narrative will resonate with which audience. You cannot copy someone's narrative construction by reading their output. The skill is in the process of taking ambiguity and creating clarity, taking complexity and creating simplicity that preserves truth. Here is how to develop narrative construction skills. First, practice identifying underlying narratives. When you read news coverage of an event, ask, what narrative is being constructed here? What facts are emphasized? What facts are omitted? What causal story is being told? Who is the protagonist? Who is the antagonist? Every piece of communication contains an embedded narrative. Most people consume these narratives unconsciously. The invisible elite deconstruct them explicitly. Second, practice constructing multiple narratives from the same facts. Take a situation from your life or work. Construct 3 different narratives that explain what happened. Notice how different framings change what seems important and what actions make sense. This develops narrative flexibility, the ability to see that facts do not determine narrative. Narrative is constructed, and you can choose which narrative serves truth and utility. Third, study great narrative constructors. Read historians who can take complex events and create clear explanatory narratives. Read journalists who can make sense of ambiguous situations. Read leaders who can inspire action through story. Notice their techniques, how they establish context, how they build tension, how they resolve complexity into clarity. Fourth, practice telling the story of your own work. Most people cannot explain what they do in a way that makes sense to others. The invisible elite can construct a narrative that makes their work comprehensible and compelling to any audience. This requires distilling complexity into essential truth, identifying the core story, removing everything that does not serve that story. Fifth, test your narratives against reality. A good narrative is not fiction. It is a frame that helps people understand what is actually happening. If your narrative makes predictions and those predictions fail, your narrative is wrong. Update it. The invisible elite construct narratives that are both clarifying and accurate. They help people understand complex reality without simplifying it into falsehood. This skill is unmimicable because it sits at the intersection of analysis, creativity, and communication. It requires understanding reality deeply enough to identify what actually matters, creative ability to construct coherent story, and communication skill to make that story resonate with others. You cannot teach this in a linear process. You cannot replicate it by copying someone's output. You can only develop it through practice constructing narratives, testing them against reality, and refining based on what works. The invisible elite are the people who make sense of chaos, who give meaning to events, who construct the stories that help others understand what is happening and what to do about it. This is the seventh and final skill of the invisible elite. You now understand the 7 skills that make someone impossible to replicate. Pattern recognition across unrelated domains, intuitive decision-making under uncertainty, creative problem-solving in novel contexts, contextual judgment and knowing when rules do not apply, relationship capital and earned trust networks, taste, discernment, and aesthetic judgment, strategic narrative construction and meaning-making. These skills share common attributes. They cannot be learned quickly. They cannot be transferred through instruction alone. They require experience combined with reflection, depth combined with breadth, technical knowledge combined with human judgment. Most importantly, they are skills that artificial intelligence cannot replicate because they are fundamentally human. They require context that only living in the world provides. They require judgment that only comes from navigating complexity with real consequences. They require relationships built over years of demonstrated character. Here is what you must understand. Building these skills is not optional if you want to remain valuable. The world is changing. Technical skills that took years to develop can now be learned in months. Tasks that required expertise can now be automated. The only protection against commoditization is becoming unmimicable. The invisible elite are not worried about automation, not because they ignore it, but because they have built skills that cannot be automated. Skills that sit at the intersection of knowledge, experience, judgment, and relationships. These are the people who will command opportunities regardless of how technology evolves, because they possess something that cannot be replicated by reading their resume, cannot be copied by watching them work, cannot be replaced by a faster or cheaper alternative. Start building these skills now, not all 7 at once. Choose one, the one that aligns most closely with your existing strengths and interests. If you are naturally curious across domains, develop pattern recognition. If you have deep experience in a field, develop intuition. If you love solving hard problems, develop creative problem solving. If you have strong relationships, develop that capital systematically. But commit to building at least one of these skills to a level where you become part of the invisible elite in that dimension, where people seek you out specifically because they cannot find anyone else who does what you do. This is not about becoming famous. Fame is often antithetical to this path. The invisible elite are called invisible precisely because they do not need public recognition. Their value is obvious to the people who matter, the people who have worked with them, the people who have seen their judgment under pressure, the people who know what they are capable of. Build skills that compound over decades, that become more valuable with time, that cannot be commoditized or automated or copied. Become unmimicable. Become part of the invisible elite.